All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is David Donaldson with the National Center for Grow Your Own, and you are here for today's webinar on building a pipeline of resilient education leaders, strategies for cultivating well-being, which aims to explore ways that systems can support leader resilience and well-being while creating a more resilient leadership pipeline that can sustain progress over the long term. Here at the National Center for Grow Your Own, we are keenly focused on not just creating pipelines of educator and leader talent, but also pipelines of educators and leaders that can persist, succeed, and flourish. And I'm really excited because you're going to hear from folks that are living that out in their respective roles today. And so we're also co-hosting today's webinar with Women Leading Ed, which is the largest national nonprofit network of women in education leadership. We have three amazing panelists, including the founder and CEO of Women Leading Ed, Dr. Julia Rafal-Baer. In addition to leading Women Leading Ed, Dr. Rafal-Baer is the CEO of the ILO Group, a woman-founded, woman-led education policy and strategy firm that works with local education districts, state education agencies, and the executive leaders of some of the nation's largest school districts. Julia, thank you for your partnership today and across so much of the work that our two organizations share in together. We're also very fortunate to be joined by two outstanding system leaders for this discussion. Dr. Sydnee Dickson, Utah State Superintendent of Public Instruction, and Dr. Luvelle Brown, the Superintendent of Ithaca City School District in New York. Dr. Dickson and Dr. Brown, we're grateful for your time, contributions to the field as well. Julia, let's start with you, as I'd like to ground our conversation in what the data and research tells us about the topic. First, why does resilience matter? And how do we define resilience in the context of educational leadership? And why is it crucial for sustaining progress?
Well, first of all, David, thanks so much for doing this session. It's so important. And Dr. Dickson and Dr. Brown, I am so honored to be able to share this space with you all, especially on this topic, and given both of your expertise and all that you've done with your careers around cultivating for yourself and for your teams a real culture of resilience. I think sometimes we talk a lot about leadership, and we tend to do it in these two ways. We talk about leadership being about traits that often can come across as being very male dominated. And as a result of that, of this idea that you have to be aggressive, decisive, and tough, I feel like we've lost a conversation that really needs to be had, which is about resilience. How do you ensure as a leader, regardless of whatever your leadership style and traits are, that you have the foundational attributes that we know matter so much, not only for your own well-being and your sustainability, but for your team and your culture? This idea of resilience and well-being as just grounding for everything that we do. And this idea that resilience is really about the ability to adapt and thrive regardless of any of the challenges and changes that are just a core part of leadership. We also know all of this matters more than ever. ILO Group puts out the only publicly available data set about what's happening in the state of the superintendency and at the state level. We look at the top 500 largest school districts. We just put out our 5th update of this, and what we are continuing to see is some of the highest turnover rates that we've continued to see since pre-pandemic. This past year, 100 districts in the top 500 experienced turnover. That's 20% of our nation's school districts that experienced at least one leadership change over this last year. It's quite really just a carousel of leadership in all of this. And because we've now had this for so many years of this level of high turnover, it means that we're churning through a new generation of leaders even faster in these pipelines. To complement all this turnover, Women Leading Ed put out an insight survey. We surveyed hundreds of women across the country to better understand what the experience of women in our nation has been. The results were really, really concerning. Nearly 6 out of 10 women report that they feel like they need to leave their jobs. They talk about the stress and strain on the job and that it causes them to think about leaving daily, weekly, or monthly. 3/4 of them said that. And what's more is that more than half of these women are sharing that their mental health is quite poor. And so there's kind of two big pieces of this that we really need to focus on. There is the incredible turnover that we are having that's impacting the entire pipeline. And then there's the reality that what is on the minds of women across the country is not great right now in terms of the ways in which the system is having an impact on them. And whether it's the strain and what happens because of bias, or the reality of having to play by a very different set of rules that demands more of women than their male colleagues in many different types of ways in these roles. Women in leadership are telling us that these systems need to change, not just for them to endure, but to thrive. Ultimately, resilience is about the idea that leaders are able to navigate all of these complexities while fostering a supportive and innovative environment for their teams so that their teams can continue to excel. Ultimately, it's always about building high growth, high impact teams. And to do that requires a focus around resilience, well-being, strong professional networks, and continuous learning for oneself and for your team about all of this. Ultimately, you'll be able then to cultivate that kind of culture that values growth and ultimately has such an impact on kids across our education system.
Julia, as you were speaking, the one quote about the looking at the 500 largest districts, I just instantly went in my head and I said, I wonder that 20% turnover, I wonder how that compares to CEOs of Fortune 500. And so while you were talking, I quickly just Googled it. The average tenure, and of course, this is all AI generated, so who knows how accurate it is. But Fortune 500 CEOs have an average tenure of 7 years. How is education superintendency, less stable than a Fortune 5? Like, there are things we need to do. And I'm grateful that we have both of our superintendents here today to give us some of the things that they have done to address that space. So Dr. Dickson, Dr. Brown, I'd love to hear your personal reactions to what Julia just framed for us. Starting with you, Superintendent Dickson, how have you personally navigated these challenges of enduring in your role? You're someone who I know is very intentional about how you allocate your time and energy. That can be very, very hard as a state superintendent, both in terms of dealing with the demands within your state, as well as contributing to the field at large. How do you prioritize your finite time?
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, looks like I've frozen, darn it. My reaction to what Julia just stated is I see it here in my own state. I feel some of those same things. And my role is to put an arm around the system and kind of a hand in the back and keep us moving forward. We need each other. So it is alarming that there's such turnover, but here's what I personally have done. I'm starting my 9th year. I'm in my 44th year of education, just for context. I have about 400 employees at our SEA, our state agency. And so I want to focus on just 3 things quickly. First of all, early on in this role, I was so overwhelmed by all the paperwork. And I've been a principal, I've been a counselor, I've worked at a district office, all the levels, and paperwork is overwhelming. So I knew that I needed to get on top of the volume of emails and all that paperwork. And I took on a personal coach. I used a system called Productive Power, and it helped me. I used Microsoft tools as well as Google, and really helped me learn a lot of tricks and tips. And so I went from feeling overwhelmed by having all those emails in my inbox that I could never get to being able to zero out at the end of the day and not having to take emails home. So just being able to feel like I could manage something and control something like my email. I know it seems simple, but it was super helpful. Now we're in the space of AI, and there are tools out there. I just learned about a tool called Notebook LM, and it can help me slog through a lot of reports, and it can turn it into a podcast, FAQs, a summary document. So we're in this stage in time where we should be using the tools that we have to help not completely eliminate, but diminish some of the struggles of paperwork. The second thing is to delegate. I learned early on that sometimes it doesn't matter what our gender. We feel when we're in positions of authority or power, we have to do it all and know it all. I had to give that up early on and surround myself with smart, capable people and give them the tools they need and the opportunities they need to grow and to be able to delegate work to them. I had a lot of people tell me I needed a chief of staff. I couldn't understand why, but I found a chief of staff and it was life-changing for me. I know that a lot of political offices have a chief of staff, and elected superintendents have chiefs of staff, but that was one of the first things I did. Super helpful and has been life-changing. And then third is paying attention to my own mental health. I can't coach, support, and talk to others about their mental health if I'm not modeling that. One of the best things I heard was advice from a mother who has her kiddos and her family read a book every summer that is just for fun and learn something new. So I picked that up and I started reading something for fun and learning something new. It's been artificial intelligence, pickleball, like everybody else in the world, but being able to learn something new. And then my go-to is just taking a walk. This morning I was coming back from a school. I'm getting into schools. So I'd had a hard couple of days, went to a school, saw amazing practice, and I'm driving by a golf course on my way back, and here was a little family of red foxes running along the fence. And you have to stop and pay attention to all those little things and realize that you're a small part of the world and you're trying to do your best, but you're not going to change everything all the time. So those are my go-tos, getting on top of paperwork, delegating, and paying attention to my mental health.
Yeah, as a former chief of staff, I really appreciate the shout out for all those. That's actually how I met Julia. So I love that example. And your point about mental health and pickleball and things like that. I am actually later today taking my first yoga lesson in over 10 years. So these are things that we all need to do in different ways for us to address those things. I really appreciate you sharing that, Superintendent. Dr. Brown, over to you. What are the pressure points in the system that you have experienced over your journey that challenges the resilience of leaders? How do you see these turnover challenges shaping your work in the experience of your team?
Thank you for the question, and it's an honor to be here with Dr. Dickson and Julia. I'm learning so much already. And yes, when Julia said, she mentioned a carousel of leadership, I see it as a crisis. And I think it's important for us to say that and be honest. Be honest about what I'm seeing. I've been in the role now 14 years in the same place, but all around me, I'm seeing the transitions and the turnover happening almost daily. And what I'm seeing is a disruption in vision. School districts are trying to create a vision, but can't do that because the leader shifts so often. I'm seeing an impact, and there's research connected to this, impact on student outcomes. And we're in the business to improve student outcomes, but when we transition leadership, it significantly impacts it negatively. And I'm seeing it cost. The cost of searches, the inability to innovate, to find new revenue streams when you have different leaders. So I think it's important for communities to be honest that this has a significant negative impact, and we need to be upfront with that in the midst of the challenge and the journey. And so I am sharing that with folks, and I also go so far as to say what we're seeing is a lack of love. Honesty is one of those principles of love, and because we're not very honest about what's happening and the impact, it's not loving. What we're also seeing is that it's not very patient. We are not giving leaders enough time to learn and to transition into the job before we're looking for a new one. Patience is needed. We're not forgiving. New leaders are going to make mistakes. Every leader is going to make a mistake. So when leaders make mistakes, do we look for another one to replace them, or do we forgive? I can go through, I've written about love and the principles that are connected to love. And what I'm learning is that school districts are not very loving right now. Love is not the default. Love is the struggle. And I say, this is a job to run to, not to run from. And I'm still excited and inspired to be in this role every day and hoping to promote love in my community and amongst our profession. And I say to folks, as I recruit administrators daily, I'm only hiring future superintendents. This transition, the folks leaving the industry, leaving the profession is happening, and it's going to continue to happen, unfortunately. And we need to have talented leaders to replace them. So if you're going to be an administrator, whether you're in the program, taking those admin courses, be thinking about being a superintendent. If not, why do this? So I'm all constantly trying to recruit and inspire folks to take on a job that's an excellent job that we should run to and not from. And that's my work. For my school district, we've sent many folks into superintendent. I think I'm up to 16 folks who've come from my school district and on my team to be superintendents. And most of them are women and people of color. Another place where we're not very honest. There aren't enough women and people of color in the superintendent role. And how often do we talk about that and why? Anyway, thank you for asking the question. I'm thinking and reflecting out loud right now. This is very therapeutic right here for me.
No, I appreciate the honesty there. If adults don't feel love, safety, security, how can we expect them to then treat students with love and for students to feel that security? Um, I also, to your one of your last points, and then also relating that back to the Fortune 500 example, Julia's, I know, done a lot of work, even just pointing out the lack of women in Fortune 500 CEO seats. And so that's also in this work. What can we learn from long tenures, but also it's not good to have long tenures if CEOs of Fortune 500 companies do not reflect America either as well. So what are we willing to trade off? And so as we get into, though, with these examples that were given, I like this pivot we're going to go in. What are solutions? How do we create more love? How do we create more resilient leaders in the right conditions? So Julia, over to you. What kind of changes do you see at the system level that we need to address turnover and help leaders to become more resilient? How can we get 16 folks out of Ithaca, New York to become superintendents as part of Dr. Brown's coaching tree and things of that nature? How can we replicate that type of work?
Yeah, and I want to first just both Dr. Dickson and Dr. Brown, you all are outliers. And that's why I was so excited to be able to be in this conversation with you all. Like, I wish that you were our norm and that the kinds of pipelines you're cultivating and the ways in which you are leading and leading with such a level of authenticity about what is required to sustain was the way we have normal conversations. But you all know like how very rare it is that space is created for the kind of conversation that we are having today, and trying to help people to understand as they're thinking about pipelines that this is actually the most important part of the solutions. Actually having this as an honest discussion, that this is actually a foundational component of how we lead. Ultimately, if the adults are not okay, the kids are not going to be okay. And I think this component of the Fortune 500 reality, where not only do you have the challenge that we've seen barely any uptake in the Fortune 500 for women in particular, we've remained at around 10% with very, very little progress in the percent of women leading. But we also have the reality that for women in these roles, they're reporting very, very similar kinds of challenges that we reported in our insight survey. I think what's glaring about education is that we're the sector about opportunity, right? We tell our kids every single day they're going to school and they can be anything they want to be. And across every single sector in society, that's not what they see. And particularly when they're looking within their own school districts. At every rung of leadership, they're seeing fewer and fewer women and women of color. And this is particularly true as you look at areas of our system like operations and finance, and areas that have typically and traditionally been more male dominated. And so there's a lot we need to do to really start to name and address bias. In our insight survey, 95% of district and state superintendents who responded, so the superintendents, reported that in their jobs, they are making sacrifices that they believe their male colleagues have not had to make in their professional worlds. So it's a pretty global perspective of women leaders in our country that that's happening. But the other big invisible task right now is elder care responsibility. We need to get real as a society about the ways in which elder care responsibility is disproportionately falling on women. And this is adding an enormous new layer of burden, everything from what those expectations on the job look like, but also about the calculation and the risk of leaving one's home and one's area where they have been supporting in that elder care way, and how much of that falls on women. Women are also reporting that they feel like they are having to work at levels of nights and weekends beyond the kinds of expectations that are had of their male colleagues. And so all of these things require a set of movement towards action and impact. In our Women Leading Ed toolkit, the time is now, we've put together an advocacy agenda with a number of areas that we think need to change, and need to change for men and for women. I think the first area, and you've heard this touched on by both Dr. Dickson and Dr. Brown, is the importance of the kind of intentional support systems that we're cultivating for everyone, but particularly for leaders of color and women, around exposure to networks, to coaches, and to sponsorship, and sponsorship being so key. Sponsors take on that hands-on role. They're giving you stretch assignments, and they're really pushing you. and helping to get you into the right power moves for your next steps. The second, we've really got to look at our hiring processes. Too often in these hiring processes, questions are asked of women that are not asked of men. Straight up questions about things like, are you going to move with your family? Are your kids going to be in this district? Things that like you don't actually hear men get asked ever in these processes. We got to renorm about what is on and off limits in order to just assess whether someone is the right fit to be a CEO, period. There's a lot we need to do in terms of helping to overcome bias that just exists, and we've got to be able to support better procedures around that. And then doing things internally within our systems, like pay audits, and just looking and doing an analysis of what is happening within our systems. We also know from our insight survey that women report not receiving any training on negotiation. Very few women have ever received that kind of formal training, and many of the women report not having experience within finance and areas of math that are really impacting them. Women Lean Ed thinks this is something we've really got to take on. It's an area we're going to be spending a lot more time on, and helping to develop model contract language. What should be in contracts for everyone to better support what we're talking about today and have it be a standard part of hiring practices. One of the superintendents I work with, a male superintendent, had in his contract off-limit times so that he could walk his daughter to school in the mornings. Can't contact him on those mornings. That should just be a norm. That should be an acceptable thing, that your mornings are off limits up to a certain time for whatever you want to do, whether it is family or well-being. But we do need to get to a place where we have clear benefits to support and sustain leaders in this, and more flexibility. And then lastly, we got to get real about real public goals. We can't keep talking about this problem. We've got to get to a place where state by state, we're setting real goals on how we are going to get to both gender equality, but also ensuring financial fairness. Women are paid less than men for doing the same jobs over and over. Our analyses keep showing it. It's not changing. And that's something that we've got to get real on. And I think for all states, being able to put out information about finalist pools, just at a level of demographics, so people know what it looks like in these finalist pools. We just are wrapping up a study we're doing with Dr. Constance Lindsay, and we took a look at 5 different states and analyzed their finalist pools. It was shocking. The number of states who over the last few years have run superintendent searches with no women in their finalist pools. You're telling me in your entire state, you could not find any women. And so I just think we got to get real about reporting out this kind of data and information, because I think people will be more shocked than they even realize about just how problematic the way in which systemic bias is impacting all levels of this.
Julia, so many things you shared there are resonating. I've seen you post before about, and I don't know the exact statistics, so please, you might want to jump in here, but about how when a job description's posted, some women may not apply unless they check 9 out of 10 boxes, but an average man has no problem. They'll apply even if they hit like 4 out of 10. Something like that. I don't know if you want to correct me on the record there.
No, but I mean, that's exactly it. Women think that they have to have every single box checked and that they've got to have results for every single one of them. And men will look at it and be like, about half them, I'm going to just go for it anyway. It's just a different way of thinking about probability, about risk, assessing how one thinks about decision-making that has just unfortunately really impacted women. There's this Korn Ferry study where they looked at resumes of men and women who were applying for jobs. And what they found at the resume level was that women consistently had more years of experience and more impact at every single career rung. When they interviewed men and women about these findings, women kept reporting the same thing. They just wanted to get a little bit more results, or they felt like they had made a commitment, they wanted to see it through. And that is amazing. It's just not the way men view their career path. Men will go into their next career rung faster and sooner than women. And that's just something we've got to start to really address and talk about. It's just a different way of calculating decision-making.
Yeah, and building off of the other solutions you had, connecting the dots here, all I could think about is your point about certain questions, inappropriate questions being asked of female candidates. If you could actually get questions asked of all candidates that are based on the actual job description and the skills needed for the job, meanwhile, Women Leading Ed is providing training on finance, operations, and maybe some other areas that current female candidates might not have experience yet in, they will shine. Like men would be exposed who applied only hitting 4 of the 10 criteria, then, and the women would shine who meet 9 of the 10 criteria. So I really love your coherent approach to saying we got to address how school boards interview folks, how they identify finalists. We also got to continue to build up the skills of the folks in our network, but also it is also just encouragement too. We see that even in our work on the teacher side of aspiring teachers, the idea of the TAP and how important that plays. So many people count themselves out before they start, and we gotta do better about that in so many things in life. Dr. Dickson, I'm interested in hearing about your experience as a woman in education leadership who has reached the heights of state leadership, and you've persisted in your position now for 8 years. That's tenure that a very, very few state leaders can lay claim to. And you've also not just had that long tenure, but while doing so, made enormous impact on student outcomes over that time. Your track record is nothing short of remarkable. What kind of experiences, supports, and practices made a difference in your leadership journey? Who helped you to realize you wanted to step into this top job? And finally, also as a leader, how have you worked to ensure those on your team have the support they need to persist?
But there's a lot in there, Dave, that you just asked me. Quite a few questions, and so much that I'm reflecting on based on what you're all saying. It's unlike me to just sit and be quiet, but that's what I feel like I need to do for a bit to absorb everything that's been said. I'm reflecting just a bit on my journey and see if I hope that will be helpful to somebody on the call. I was not one who should have even gone to college. I had a high school counselor who discouraged me from going to college, told me I didn't need to go to college. I could just go be a secretary. And even that, if I even needed to do that, and 5 degrees later, that really motivated me to say, oh, yes, I will. And yes, I can. But I'm thinking about what Julia said in terms of checking all the boxes and fast forwarding to this position now, which I'll talk a little bit about how I got here. But I'm thinking about when we have a position open that's at the executive level. I've been with my admin team. We've been together 8 years. I feel so fortunate. So anything I get credit for, it's because I have an amazing team and we've led a lot of initiatives together. And I remember when my team was first together and it was more female heavy than men. And a couple of my board members said to me, don't you want to get more men on there? And I thought, you would never say that to a team of men. You wouldn't come and say, don't you need more females? So I always remembered that question. But now when there's an opening, I have more females call and ask if I think they would be a good fit for the role, checking all the boxes, where men will ask me about the role. Like they'll focus on the details of the job, where women will focus on their confidence about wondering if they're a good fit for the job. And you've helped me reflect on how we might even change how people think about the roles. To Luvelle's point, how do you build a coalition of the willing and then help them understand that they've got what it takes to get into the role? So without too many details as to how I became a superintendent, it was not on my bucket list at all, nor was working at a state agency. But there was just a series of events that happened, and I was asked to be an interim deputy. And I said, sure, they needed the help, and I was happy to lean in. And that happened again in the role of superintendency, the role of the superintendent. And I remember talking to my husband and saying, they're kind of asking me to do this interim thing, and now the job is open. And what do you think? And he said, if not you, then who? Like, my husband was the one that said, why wouldn't you do this? You know the job. Why would you step back and let somebody else do it? Or even think that somebody else should do it? You know how to do this. So it was just the great encouragement of my husband knowing how much I would maybe not be at home. So that's one thing I wanted to reflect on, is just like, if not us, then who? And sometimes we just second guess ourselves. Then, you ask about longevity, and I would say to everything that's been said, we're experiencing in Utah. We have 41 districts and over 100 charter schools, but in the districts where you have an elected board and often a contract, Dr. Lexi Cunningham's on this call. She's our executive director of our state superintendents, or our superintendents association. And she was reminding me the other day that 80% of our superintendents are new in the last 4 years. And I was reflecting on something I was frustrated about, thinking, well, wait a minute, we did this back in 2017. Why do I have to rehash this? And why can't I build this momentum? Oh, that's because 80% of you are new and you don't have this history. So, you know, how are we building momentum through the whole system? So regardless of where you're at, we can elevate people to the system. So quickly, just going through the longevity pieces. You know, I think the first and foremost is being mission driven. I don't have a contract. I'm an at-will employee. I've never had a contract. And just being mission driven has really kept me focused. And then I don't worry if I'm not in this position tomorrow or the day after. I know that I've shown up and done my best because I'm very mission driven. The other thing that Julia talked about is networks. Networks are so important. Female networks, networks of color, wherever you find your tribe that helps you feel grounded, you need networks of all sorts, male, female. And then I like to engage with people that think very differently than me. When I first got into the job, excuse me, I engaged with thought leaders, thought partners, CEOs of banks, community leaders, nonprofit leaders, people that were not in the education space, but I viewed them and valued them as leaders. I went to them and talked to them about leadership styles and public education. And I think I'm going to have to shift this back to you, David. I've got a tickle. And then last but not least, just paying attention to culture. Culture matters a lot.
Well, there's no doubt that you've created such a positive culture. I have to believe one of the reasons for such an incredibly long and impactful tenure, and it's something unfortunately that is so rare, is your willingness to give credit to your team. It is just such, like, there is no, and the fact that earlier you talked about having a coach, it is just such a transparent, as Julia mentioned earlier, authentic conversation you all are having. But I mean, your team thinks the world of you based on the folks that I get to interact with. And it's just so encouraging to see somebody that wants their folks to succeed and gives credit where credit is due. That talk about building loyalty. And for you to say, if I understood correctly, you've had pretty much the same team since the beginning of your tenure. That's incredible. That only happens due to your leadership. So just, I believe in giving credit where credit is due, and you deserve your
and
roses
choosing the right people. Come on, it's never solo. You got to get the right people on the bus.
Yeah, and that's interesting. So let's bring that back really quick. I just want to make a really quick point to the board thing that Julia brought up earlier. Dr. Dickson, you're being proactive. You were proactive in identifying talent. You don't just wait for who applies to you, like typical. I'm not typical school board. Well, who's the candidates who applied? This is what we got. Woe is us. We only identified these individuals. No, you got to be proactive. And so that makes such a big difference. Dr. Brown, this is a perfect segue over to you. You talked about being proactive in the way you recruit principals, saying, I want you, I only want you if you want to be a superintendent. That type of thinking, really appreciate that proactive thought and getting them to see themselves of where they can be and that tells them I'm going to grow if I work here. So with that said, Dr. Brown, one thing that I know Julia and Women Leading Ed team talk a lot about is allyship, having men in education leadership work to advance women, bring the change needed to systems to address bias, and play their personal role in demonstrating positive leadership examples for all leaders. In your book from 2018, Culture of Love, you've outlined a process of self-reflection, conflict, and policy change as a way to address bias and inequality in systems. With that said, I'm interested in hearing from you more about how that same approach through an allyship lens could inform the work of creating more sustainable leadership pipelines and the conditions that support leader persistence. Dr. Brown?
No, great question, and thank you for reading the book. And it strikes me today that Julia has to do this work. We're on this call today because the culture has perpetuated an environment where we need to. The culture is leading to us not having enough women represented in leadership roles. The culture is allowing for us not to have people of color aspire to be and become superintendents. And so, and I write in the book now, the culture does not change until the policy changes first. Just think about the history of our country. When we talk about access and opportunities for everyone and equitable results, that didn't just happen. People had to fight for it. My family, I come from a family of activists, and my mother was an abolitionist, she would refer to herself. We had to fight and fight and fight until policies changed to allow for us to then be seen and then be assessed and then have access for the first time and opportunities to achieve at the highest levels. And we're still waiting for those equitable results, but that will come over time. But the policy had to change first in order to change the culture for me even to be here. Now, to change the culture, it starts with reflection. And we talk in my book, and we've talked on this call. We got to reflect in a real and honest way about the numbers, the data, how we got here. Just me saying that the culture that exists is one of supremacy that's perpetuated the issues that we say we want to eradicate. We don't say that enough. And in many states, if we say it, folks want to cite you or you get in trouble. So if we're going to be reflective, let's be honest and be reflective in a real authentic way. And then we can get to the friction and the conflict. See, that conflict is, yeah, we have sessions like this where we talk, and hopefully over the last 90 seconds at least, someone is uncomfortable about what I've just said. That is okay. That's constructive conflict and friction. When we sit in a space like this and we realize we've done wrong by women, if we can't sit with that, then that's not conflict. And when we do that, when we have these sessions, we write white papers, we put together committees, we put together work groups like the one Julia's leading. That is the friction, and that's the capacity building that's needed for us to get to, all right, now we're going to write a policy. And I've heard the word bias training on this call 8 times. How many states, how many school districts have a policy in their organization that requires everyone to go through bias training before sitting on an interview committee? We do. And when you go through that training, before you sit down on that committee, you are now aware of how we have perpetuated inequities over generations. And you're now thinking about your thinking. You're thinking about confirmation bias. You think about your racism, your sexism, your classism. And then you can then be a better interviewer. And frankly, you may actually recommend someone who's not consistent with the dominant approach to the organization. You see, that requires a policy change, and I can go through many other policies that, frankly, from my perspective, are on the books now to perpetuate what we're getting and how we need to interrupt those policies to lead to a culture change. So that's the work. We have many artifacts and receipts from my school district and our state now as we've worked on this. But again, I'm 14 years in, and there was a lot of conflict to get to a place where we're now putting in place policy that has and is continuing to change the culture.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. My first superintendent, Dr. Andres Alonso, CEO of Baltimore City, I remember he used to say, and I'm paraphrasing here, but the whole point of policy is to bend it as far as humanly possible before it breaks. And then I think about the work. Julia, we were all talking before this call started. Julia was telling a story about stepping back in New York where she had previously worked. Earlier this week, actually yesterday, I was in Columbus, Ohio for the first time in 7 years, and it's where I worked for my mentor, who Julia and I shared, Dr. Lillian Wolry, former state sup of Maryland and Delaware, and I didn't realize it would be an emotional experience. I just hadn't been back in Columbus. And I think about her all the time when it came to, those days where you thought you were taking, you lost the battle. You might not have lost the war yet, but you lost the battle. And she would, in talking with her, there would always be any policy that exists today was created by a man or a woman. Therefore, a man or a woman can change said policy. It's always at looking forward, what can be. Just because something is today doesn't mean it has to be that way tomorrow. So Dr. Brown, I really appreciate your focus on abolitionism and advocacy on changing policy in order to then also have an impact on culture. Thank you for sharing that. Julia, back over to you. We've spoken a lot about systems and policy change so far, but one of your superpowers is in direct coaching, working personally with leaders to ensure they succeed. I don't even know what the number is at this point of how many superintendents you've placed. I remember it was like at least 75, but even, and I'm excited to hear what the number is now, but even beyond that, you don't just place folks. You then offer services to help with strategic plans, 90-day plans, 100-day plans, and ongoing work, and also not just for the superintendent, him or herself, but their leadership team. I'm curious what practices, in addition to what I just named about great work you do, what additional practices or behaviors do you see as most beneficial for leaders looking to find that balance and sustainability in these incredibly demanding roles?
Well, thanks, David. We are past the 75 mark. We're at the 76 mark. And it's something I'm so incredibly just honored, and it's an incredible privilege to be on a journey with a leader who decides to make a big bet on themselves and to really go and commit to trying to get one of these really big jobs. But what I tell every leader that I work with, you're never going to be alone. Like every single step from here on out, I will personally be behind you. Our entire network will be behind you. And this is for the men and the women that we support on these journeys. Because if you're going to take these jobs, then you got to go do something really big for kids. And doing something really big for kids means you have to sustain for the long haul. You can't just go in there and blow things up. You're not going to get outcomes and change things. And so for me, it's really about making sure that when I'm working with leaders, that I'm as all in with them, that we build a level of trust and an ability to have very transparent, very honest conversations. And I always tell people I'm not going to be everyone's cup of tea. I am going to make sure, though, that you outwork everyone that you are in this with. And that as you get into that role, when you say that something is going to be your biggest bet, if you decide that you want the support, we will be there to make sure that you execute on that biggest bet. When I think about some of the most important behaviors that leaders need to possess, I actually start with thinking about when I was a competitive figure skater. And I don't know how many of you I've shared this with, but I was a competitive figure skater till I was 18. I started skating when I was 2.5 years old. And as I think about the life lessons that come from competitive sports, actually more and more have come to realize that the lessons of sport are some of the most foundational for all of our kids to learn. It's everything from thinking about how you identify and set your goals, how you work backwards to get to those goals, how you sustain when things aren't going so well, how you learn to have self-discipline, time management, using feedback to course correct and improve, and ultimately how you learn to be a part of teams, even if you're a part of an individual sport in what you're doing. All of those are skills that are so essential to leadership. Second, and we've talked a lot about this, you need to have coaches and you need to have sponsors. One of the things I hear over and over again from people is, I don't have a sponsor. I don't know how to do that. Or I hear the other side, I actually don't currently sponsor anybody. Just keep in mind, sponsors want to make a bet on a winner. And they want to know that when they put their time into you, that you're going to knock it out of the park and that you're going to come to them early and often when things are bumpy, and that you're really coming to them as somebody who is there for you and able to help support you. And you want to make sure that you have these kinds of relationships that you're leaning on, not just when things are rough, but also when you want to just have that personal perspective, especially when stress levels are rising. Trusted relationships matter more than anything. And I think very often we've treated coaching as something that you do at distinct points of your career early on. I think we need to change our mindset about coaching the same way that I think in society we're changing our mindsets about therapy. Therapy, coaching, all of these things have to be seen as just a core part of every stage of your development. The same coach that you start with is not going to be the same coach at other parts of your career. At Women Leading Ed, we take an approach around coaching that's more like a holistic medicine practice. Whatever issue is going on, you have a team of different coaches who are there to provide advice. We don't think there's any one coach that has all of the information and all that is necessary to help you get through things. And we also take a 24/7 approach. So there's always somebody on call, no matter what, when you're working with us. Number 3, all leaders need to prioritize personal well-being. You've heard this on the call from both Dr. Dickson and Dr. Brown. You have to make the time, not just on the mental health, but I think often we forget about physical health. Like the big rocks, your medical appointments have to be big rocks. Your dentists have to be big rocks. Like all these things can't just fall by the wayside. And the other thing that's been on my mind a lot lately as being so critical is the importance of deep friendship. There's been a lot of research about how much as a society we're losing sight of friendship as being important. And in fact, how much harder it becomes at later stages of life. And I think deep friendship and the kind of introspection that deep friendship brings and being able to have that is so important, and also shifting it. I'm sure Dr. Dickson is making a lot of new friends on the pickleball court and will continue to do so. And that's kind of the great thing about thinking about the importance of friendship as a big rock as a leader. And then we heard this one from Dr. Dickson, so I'll just echo quickly, delegation. You've got to be able to embrace delegation. Effective leaders know that they cannot do everything and that they're going to be better because of the diversity that comes from other people's opinions, and being able to just let go, recognize no one is going to do it the way that you do it. But that's sort of the beauty of leadership, is letting go and sort of seeing how your team creates and shows value. And the last one, and I'm probably the worst to even say this out loud, but boundaries, of which I would not put that as a core competency for me personally, but it really is super critical for superintendents. Superintendents set the tenor, but they also have to have their own boundaries, not only with governors and their boards and with the media and other political actors, but also just to show their teams, even if they themselves are struggling within those boundaries. It's important that superintendents are showing that those boundaries exist. These are just some of the kind of big ticket items that I've seen, but I think in all of this, recognizing that we're all human, none of these are going to be 100%, but they're all the kinds of competencies that we're trying to continue to evolve into.
Julia, I really appreciate all those points you made, reflecting your calling out of that Superintendent Dickson had made about delegation, and just the level of self-assurance you have to be willing to let go and delegate. That is something that can be a learning curve, and I'm just frankly speaking to myself, is something that I've struggled with. We can maybe hold each other accountable offline, boundaries of me with delegating, but it is something that again shows Dr. Dickson's belief in her team and how much more you can accomplish when you're able to delegate. It's always worth the trade-off than trying to do things yourself. And so Dr. Dickson, I appreciate you sharing that from earlier, and Julia, you highlighting. And another point you made about coaches and maybe, what got you here won't get you there, that there might be different times in life you need to have different coaches. Trying to make a connection back to Dr. Brown's point earlier, how he mentioned he had folks that have gone on to be superintendents. I think the NFL coaching tree, you look at certain coaches that have then inspired others to become coaches and all the connections there. But the other thing that's related to that with the NFL is, yeah, there's a head coach, but then there's a quarterback's coach. There's a defensive line coach. There is, a linebackers coach, a running back coach. As we think about that specialized coaching as well, how can leaders, you might need a coach for dealing with your board, and you might need a coach for dealing with your team. And those could be two different people. So Julia, I really appreciate you highlighting the need for coaches and maybe different coaches along the way. And also, coaches for certain areas of growth or certain responsibilities or skill sets that you might be trying to develop. With that said, turning things back over to Dr. Brown and Dr. Dickson. Let's start with Dr. Brown on here. Based on what we've already discussed, what do you think are the most important takeaways for our audience to leave with today? What are the critical efforts that you think need to move forward to both support today's leaders and create that sustainable leadership pipeline?
Thank you again for this opportunity. I've learned so much. I've been frantically taking notes. So to try to talk about highlights or summarize the most important would be tough. But I would leave folks with this, reminding them that this leadership journey is one to run to and not run from. And to start this journey and all along this journey, I would ask folks to just be reflective, curious and reflective about how to be better, and reflective, most importantly, about how to find joy. I write every day about what brings me joy. Because I want to give joy, I need to know what brings me joy first. And yeah, I know that getting up and working out every day brings me joy. I know hanging out with family brings me joy. I know that eating a good meal every day brings me joy. So I have to build that in. And it's important for the superintendents who are listening, you know how hard it is to schedule time to eat, how hard it is to schedule time to be with your family and to work out. So those are in my schedule, just like any other important meeting. And because I have that joy in my personal life, I can then figure out how to build joy in my professional one as well. So to recognize where there are inequities, like the one we're talking about today, that brings me joy to find out where that is happening and to be a staunch advocate and activist to interrupt it. And so coaching folks who are underrepresented in leadership roles brings me joy because I see the results of that labor, and I see successes. And see that professional joy is sustaining me too. So what I think I would take away from this is, yeah, this is a beautiful time to be a leader. And to be a leader, you must lead yourself first in that cultivation of your own joy, both at home and in the workforce. And then we will have sustainability. We need people to stay in this role for decades, not months. And there is a way to do that. That's going to require love and joy. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. As Julia said, Dr. Brown, you and Dr. Dickson are currently outliers in this work. How do we make your incredible impact and tenures the new normal? Really appreciate your focus on that and Julia's focus. Dr. Dickson, actually going to ask you the same question, but I'm going to repeat it just for the audience so that they hear it again before you respond, if that's all right. And so based on what we've discussed, Dr. Dickson, what do you also think are the most important takeaways for our audience to leave with today? What are the critical efforts that you think need to move forward to both support today's leaders and create that sustainable leadership pipeline?
Well, thank you also for the opportunity, and thanks to Dr. Brown for your exuberance around love and joy. I want to come work for you and with you for sure. I think my takeaway as I've listened to everybody is that it is a great time to be a leader, and we have to stay human-centered. There are all sorts of things that come at us, and it might be packaged in politics or challenges from a particular group or personal challenges, but we have to really stay human-centered. One of the greatest compliments I can ever get is to have one of my staff members expertly acquired. We don't say stolen or pilfered, but expertly acquired. And it's because I surround myself with great, thoughtful, hardworking people, and other people want to work with them. And we have that happen from time to time. So building a deep bench, as Dr. Brown has taught us, and making sure that those people are well cared for. I'm sorry, fall allergies. Beautiful fall in Utah came with allergies today. So I think the last thing is reflecting on today has helped me reflect on a talk that I heard as a young adult. And I don't remember the title, but the content was about choosing between two rights. And I think Julia's addressed this well. We have a lot of things that we can choose to do, and some of them are all the right thing, but we have to set boundaries for ourselves. So sometimes it's better to go be with your father-in-law in memory care. I'm speaking for myself now, than show up to a photo op with the governor. Or sometimes it's more important to take that walk and then get on a seminar that you already know the content. We don't have to be everything to everyone and be everywhere all the time, but we need to be present in the moment, whatever that moment is. And in order to do that, we have to do all the things that Dr. Brown talked about, taking care of ourselves physically, mentally, socially. As Julia pointed out, I think having friendships are important. And we spend a lot of time at work. So our family and the culture we build in that work family is really important. Being in schools, you can walk in the door, and for me, at least within 5 minutes, I can describe the culture in the school and probably the leadership style of the principal who's led to that kind of culture. And it can happen in any of our schools. And I expect that of myself as a leader. What kind of culture do I create so that I can build a deep bench and make sure that people want to come and they want to stay? And we've got to create those working conditions for our leaders. And I'm so appreciative that you put this together to focus on working conditions for the leaders who are leading our education systems. That's what will sustain us if we can get those working conditions right. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Dickson, for taking time out of your day to share from your wisdom, not just based on, obviously every day you're providing leadership in Utah, but now sharing it today with folks across the country. This is a timely topic and one that, frankly, we need to talk more and more about. Julia, anything else that you'd like to add before wrap things up? You're good? Okay. So I personally, on behalf of National Center for Grow Your Own and Women Leading Ed, would like to thank Dr. Brown and Dr. Dickson for sharing their expertise, and also just love the complementary nature of the two of them amongst each other, and also to Julia. And then I personally want to also thank Julia just for being a great partner and friend in this work. If you were on this call and had not heard of ILO Group or Women Leading Ed, get to know them. We're going to end this call 2 minutes early. Go on their website. All the work they do is incredible work. And as Julia knows, I just couldn't be more proud to have her as a colleague in this work. Ithaca, New York, Utah, you're in good hands and will continue to be so with the leadership that's here. Everybody, thank you so much. There will be a recording of this and it will be made available at a later date and on social media channels that you see on this slide as well. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care now. Bye-bye.